The steam rose from the bowl, carrying an unfamiliar aroma that made Helga Brandt wrinkle her nose in disgust. It was April 12, 1945, at Fort Oglethorpe internment camp in Georgia, and the 23-year-old former radio operator for the Luftwaffe stared down at the pale, gelatinous mass she had just been served. The American guard had called it grits, but to her eyes, it looked suspiciously like the slop Germans fed to livestock. "Das ist Tierfutter," she whispered to her fellow prisoners, drawing nervous laughter from the women crowded around the mess hall table. "That's animal feed." But as hunger gnawed at her stomach after 2 days of refusing to touch the strange food, Helga reluctantly raised a small spoonful to her lips. What she tasted in that moment defied 4 years of Reich propaganda about American deprivation and scarcity. The grits were creamy, warm, filling, and topped with a generous pat of butter that melted into a golden pool. Butter. Real butter. More dairy fat in this one serving than she had seen in months back in bomb-ravaged Berlin. Helga's eyes widened as she took another spoonful, then another. By the third bite, tears were streaming down her face. What this simple cornmeal dish revealed was not just a cultural difference in cuisine, but an impossible reality. America had so much food that they could afford to give prisoners of war better meals than what German civilians back home could access. What Helga experienced that morning would shatter 12 years of carefully constructed Nazi indoctrination about American weakness and scarcity. It was more than a bowl of unfamiliar food. It was mathematical proof that everything she had been told about the enemy was a lie. When Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States in December 1941, German propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels immediately set to work crafting a narrative about America for domestic consumption. The United States, according to official Reich communications, was a paper tiger, a nation of soft, undisciplined people suffering from severe resource shortages, lacking industrial capacity, and incapable of mounting an effective military response. German newsreels and newspapers repeatedly emphasized American food rationing, portraying a nation on the brink of starvation. According to a 1943 issue of the Völkischer Beobachter, the official Nazi Party newspaper, American families subsist on meager portions while their government promises food to the world. The reality of American agricultural and industrial might was deliberately obscured from the German people. By 1943, German civilians were restricted to weekly rations that included only 125 grams of butter, 300 grams of meat, and 250 grams of sugar. The Reich's Ministry of Food and Agriculture had been reducing rations steadily as the war progressed, and by early 1945, many German civilians were surviving on fewer than 1,000 calories per day. Meanwhile, in the United States, despite modest rationing, the average citizen consumed approximately 3,200 calories daily. This stark contrast was something the Nazi regime worked desperately to conceal from its population. When the first German prisoners of war began arriving on American soil in 1942, they entered a system designed according to the Geneva Convention's standards, a stark contrast to the treatment Allied POWs received in German camps. The United States War Department established more than 500 POW facilities across 45 states, holding approximately 371,000 German prisoners by the war's end. Though male soldiers constituted the vast majority, a small number of female military personnel, mainly signals operators, nurses, and administrative staff captured in North Africa and later in Europe, were also among the detained. These women, including Helga Brandt and her compatriots, were housed in special sections of camps like Fort Oglethorpe, Georgia, and Camp Shanks, New York. They arrived expecting harsh conditions based on what they had been told about America's inability to feed its own population. What they found instead was the first evidence that would unravel their ideological certainties. Margarete Schulz had served as a communications specialist with the 12th SS Panzer Division before her capture in France in August 1944. Her diary, later preserved in the National Archives, recorded her initial reactions to American abundance with palpable shock. "We were told America was rationing everything, that their people were standing in bread lines," she wrote on September 3, 1944. "Yet today I received 2 eggs for breakfast. 2 eggs! When German civilians are lucky to get 2 eggs per month. I dare not write home about this. They would think I am being forced to write propaganda." This cognitive dissonance, the gap between what prisoners had been told to expect and what they actually experienced, became a central feature of the German POW experience in America. For women prisoners like Margarete and Helga, whose roles in the Nazi military apparatus had often been ideological as well as practical, this dissonance was particularly acute. Dr. Erich Kostermann, a historian at the University of Munich who studied post-war testimonials from returned POWs, documented this phenomenon extensively. The female prisoners often experienced the most severe ideological disruption, he noted in his 1978 analysis. They had been more thoroughly immersed in Reich propaganda about American inadequacy, and they were often the most dedicated believers. When confronted with evidence that contradicted everything they had been told, their entire worldview began to crumble. This crumbling began, almost invariably, with food. The journey of discovery for German women POWs typically began at the processing centers where they were initially detained after arriving in the United States. For Ingrid Weber, a 25-year-old former nurse with the German Red Cross who had been captured in Tunisia in May 1943, the first shock came during her intake at Fort Patrick Henry in Virginia. "They gave us each a full cup of real coffee," she recalled in a 1967 interview. "Not ersatz coffee made from acorns or barley, but genuine coffee with milk and sugar. The guard gave it to me as if it were nothing special, but I had not tasted real coffee since 1940. My hands were shaking as I held the cup." Coffee had become a luxury item in Germany early in the war, with the blockade cutting off imports. By 1943, even high-ranking Nazi officials were drinking coffee substitutes made from roasted grains. Yet, here was an American guard casually handing cups of genuine coffee to enemy prisoners as part of a standard intake procedure. For Helga Brandt, the revelations continued beyond that first encounter with grits. In her debriefing interviews conducted after repatriation, she described the systematic dismantling of her beliefs about American scarcity. "The second day, they gave us white bread. Not brown bread, not bread extended with sawdust as we had at home in the last years, but pure white bread. I thought it must be some special occasion, but then we had it again the next day. And the next. One of the guards saw me saving crusts in my pocket, and he laughed. He said, 'You can have more if you're still hungry?' More, as if bread were not precious." This casual attitude toward what had become a scarce commodity in Germany represented more than cultural difference. It was a mathematical equation that pointed toward American industrial capacity, that dwarfed Germany's war-strained resources. Louise Hoffmann, who had served as an administrative clerk with the Luftwaffe before being captured in Italy in October 1943, found herself assigned to kitchen duty at Fort Oglethorpe. Her position gave her a particularly clear view of American abundance. "They threw away more food in one day than my family in Hamburg would receive in a month of rations," she wrote in a letter smuggled to her sister through a Red Cross package. "Yesterday, I watched the cook discard 3 pounds of beef trimmings that were perfectly edible. When I asked if I could save them to make soup, she looked at me strangely and said they already had soup prepared for the week. An entire wheel of cheese had developed a small spot of mold, and the whole thing was discarded. In Germany, we would have cut away the small bad section and treasured the rest." This casual waste was more psychologically devastating to many prisoners than any interrogation technique could have been. It provided irrefutable evidence that the American war machine was operating from a position of abundance that Germany could not hope to match. The contrast extended beyond food to other basics. Gertrude Munch, a signals operator captured in North Africa with Rommel's Afrika Korps, described her first shower at Camp Shanks. Hot water came out immediately. Not lukewarm water that had been carefully heated and conserved, but instantly hot water, and as much as you wanted. I stood under it for what felt like an eternity, thinking about my mother and sisters in Munich boiling small pots of water for their weekly bath. The American guards, seemingly oblivious to what represented incredible luxury to the prisoners, grew impatient with the German women who lingered in the showers, not understanding that they were experiencing a resource that had become scarce in their bombed homeland. For many of the women, the most shocking revelation came in the form of the standard POW clothing issue. Each prisoner received multiple sets of clean underwear, socks, shirts, and pants, or skirts. More clothing at once than many had owned in total in the last years of war-strained Germany. Helga Brandt recalled the distribution. The American supply sergeant gave each of us 3 complete changes of clothes and said we would get clean items weekly. When Greta Hoffman asked what we should do with our old undergarments, the American woman looked confused and said, "Throw them away." Throw away clothing? This was incomprehensible. By 1944, German civilians were patching and repatching garments, making children's clothes from adult items and using every scrap of fabric. The concept of discarding usable clothing, even something as basic as undergarments, had become unthinkable in the resource-constrained Reich. What made these discoveries particularly powerful was their pedestrian nature. These were not special accommodations or propaganda displays put on for the prisoners' benefit. They were simply the standard operating procedures of the American military and the background reality of American production capacity. Captain Eleanor Richards, who supervised the women's section at Fort Oglethorpe, noted in her reports that the German prisoners seemed abnormally interested in routine supply matters and often asked questions about how much of various items the United States produced. Their disbelief when given accurate figures suggests they have been subjected to significant misinformation about American capabilities, she observed. The questions the prisoners asked revealed the extent of their miseducation. Margaret Schultz recalled asking a guard how America could afford to give prisoners eggs when they must surely be rationed. He looked at me as if I were speaking another language and said that American farms produced more than 12 billion eggs per year. 12 billion! I asked him to repeat the number, certain I had misheard. He seemed amused by my shock. Similarly, Ingrid Weber reported asking about milk production and being told that America produced more than 55 billion kilograms of milk annually. These numbers were so large they seemed fictional, she wrote. How could we hope to win a war against a nation with such capacity? As 1944 progressed into 1945, and as Allied bombing devastated German infrastructure, the contrast between conditions in the homeland and what prisoners experienced in America grew even starker. Letters from family members, heavily censored but still conveying the increasingly desperate conditions in Germany, arrived at the POW camps describing meals of turnip soup and bread made with sawdust. Meanwhile, the prisoners were receiving diets that, according to War Department regulations, were to be equivalent to those of American garrison troops. This meant approximately 3,200 calories daily, including meat at most meals, fresh vegetables, fruit, dairy products, and desserts, items that had become distant memories for German civilians. For Helga Brandt, the mathematical impossibility of Germany's victory became clear in February 1945, when she was assigned to work in the camp's administrative office filing supply requisitions. I saw an order for 20,000 pounds of beef for 1 month, for our camp alone, she later testified. This was one camp out of hundreds, ordering more meat in a month than might reach an entire German city in the same period. When I saw these numbers, I understood that Germany had lost the war long before the first shot was fired. We were fighting a nation that could outproduce us at a ratio that made victory mathematically impossible. This realization that the war had been lost on the factory floors before it was lost on the battlefields became a common theme in later interviews with repatriated prisoners. The women's exposure to American abundance went beyond the camps, when some were assigned to supervised work details. Under the Geneva Convention, enlisted prisoners could be required to work in non-war-related positions, and by 1944, labor shortages had led to German POWs being employed in agriculture, food processing, and other civilian sectors. Louise Hoffman was among a group sent to work at a cannery in rural Georgia, where she witnessed American food production firsthand. "We worked sorting peaches," she recounted. Any fruit with the smallest blemish was discarded into enormous waste bins. I asked the supervisor if the rejected fruit could be used for jam or preserves instead of being thrown away. She said it wasn't worth the trouble when there were so many perfect peaches available. In one day, I saw more wasted fruit than my neighborhood in Hamburg would receive in a year. This pattern repeated itself across various work assignments. German prisoners assigned to agricultural work saw vast farms with mechanical equipment that had become rare in their homeland as metal was diverted to military production. Those working in food processing witnessed the scale of American canning operations that could preserve millions of units daily. Those assigned to laundry facilities saw mechanized washing machines and dryers that could process in hours what would take German housewives days of manual labor. Each new exposure added another piece to the puzzle that was reshaping their understanding of the enemy they had been fighting. The Camp Shanks commander, Colonel Arthur Roth, documented this phenomenon in his quarterly reports. "The German women prisoners display particular interest in our supply systems and production methods," he wrote in April 1945. When shown the camp's warehouse during their orientation, several became visibly emotional at the sight of the stored goods. One prisoner, upon seeing the quantity of canned food in storage, stated that Berlin had not had such reserves since before the war began. This emotional response to material abundance became a defining characteristic of the German POW experience in America. Helga Brandt's encounter with the Grits that April morning in 1945 was emblematic of a larger process unfolding across hundreds of POW facilities. The transformation began with disbelief, moved through shock and sometimes anger, and eventually settled into a reluctant acknowledgement that they had been systematically misled by their own leadership. This pattern was so consistent that American intelligence officers developed a timeline for what they called the collapse of ideological certainty among prisoners. According to reports from the War Department's Prisoner of War Special Projects Division, the typical German prisoner passed through this process in approximately 3 to 4 months. For the most ideologically committed, particularly young women who had been members of Nazi youth organizations before joining military service, the process sometimes took longer, but followed the same trajectory. By mid-1945, as Germany's military situation deteriorated rapidly on both fronts, the psychological state of the women prisoners reflected a complex mix of emotions. They worried about family members facing Allied bombing and Soviet advances, while simultaneously coming to terms with the revelation that their nation's leadership had led them into a war they could not possibly win. This cognitive dissonance played out in their daily interactions with American guards and staff. Margarete Schulz's diary entries from this period reveal this internal struggle. "I find myself hating the Americans for their wasteful abundance, while my mother likely goes hungry in Dresden. Yet I also hate the lies we were told that brought us to this hopeless situation. Which betrayal is greater?" The overwhelming evidence of American industrial and agricultural might manifested in countless ways throughout the prisoners' internment. The physical transformation of the prisoners themselves became one of the most visible markers. German POWs arriving in America in 1944 and 1945, after years of increasingly restricted rations in their homeland, were often undernourished. Camp medical records show that many prisoners gained significant weight during their internment. Helga Brandt, according to her medical file, arrived weighing 105 pounds and gained 23 pounds within 4 months. Similar patterns appeared across prisoner records, with average weight gains of 15 to 20 pounds, common among women prisoners who had experienced food scarcity before capture. This physical transformation was noticed by the prisoners themselves. "My uniform had to be altered twice because it became too tight," Ingrid Weber wrote in her journal. "My face in the mirror has become round again, like before the war." It seems obscene to grow fat while Germany starves, yet I cannot deny the feeling of relief to have a full stomach again. This physical restoration was accompanied by improvements in overall health. Camp medical records documented resolution of nutritional deficiencies, increased energy levels, and improved dental health among prisoners who had suffered from years of wartime deprivation. The scale of American production became increasingly clear to the prisoners as the war progressed. In late 1944, a group of women prisoners, including Helga Brandt, was transported from Fort Oglethorpe to Camp Shanks. The journey took them through several industrial centers, offering glimpses of American manufacturing capability that contradicted everything they had been told. "We passed a Ford automobile plant outside of Detroit," Helga later reported. "It stretched for what seemed like kilometers, with thousands of workers changing shifts. Our escort mentioned casually that this single factory produced 1 bomber per hour, 1 heavy bomber every 60 minutes, day and night." Germany's entire monthly aircraft production was being matched by this one American factory in a matter of days. This offhand comment, delivered without any propagandistic intent, crystallized for Helga and her fellow prisoners the fundamental mathematical reality of the war's inevitable outcome. The prisoners' exposure to American agricultural abundance was equally revealing. Louise Hoffman, during her work assignment at a Georgia farm, witnessed the harvesting of a wheat field using combined harvesters that could accomplish in hours what would have required dozens of farm workers' days to complete in Germany. The farmer told us his 300-acre farm was considered small by American standards, she noted with astonishment. He showed us a magazine with photographs of farms in Kansas and Nebraska that covered thousands of acres, all harvested by machines. With such agricultural efficiency, how could they ever be starved into submission, as our leaders had claimed? This question, how Germany could have hoped to defeat such productive capacity, became a common refrain in prisoner discussions. The contrast extended beyond food and industrial output to everyday items that had become luxuries in wartime Germany. Gertrude Munch recorded her surprise at the ubiquity of items like soap, paper, and rubber, all severely rationed in Germany. "Each prisoner receives a full bar of soap monthly," she wrote to a fellow prisoner. "Not the gritty gray soap we had at home that barely lathered, but white soap that smells clean and washes completely. The Americans use paper towels and throw them away after one use. Rubber bands and erasers are left lying around as if they are worthless. When at home, a single rubber band would be used until it broke, then knotted and used again." These small items represented more than mere conveniences. They were indicators of an industrial system, operating without the constraints that had become normal in the resource-starved Reich. What made these revelations particularly powerful was that they couldn't be dismissed as propaganda. The prisoners were not being shown carefully staged displays designed to impress them. They were simply experiencing the everyday reality of American wartime production. Captain Richards noted in her reports that some prisoners initially suspected they were being shown a Potemkin village version of America, designed to demoralize them. But indeed, it was only after several months when they realized that what they were seeing was considered ordinary by Americans that the full psychological impact took hold, she wrote. The statistical comparisons became increasingly devastating as prisoners gained access to more information. In the camp libraries, which contained newspapers and magazines with production figures that would have been classified in Germany, prisoners could read about American manufacturing achievements that seemed like fantasy to those familiar with Germany's strained wartime economy. A Time magazine article from January 1945, read by several prisoners at Fort Oglethorpe, reported that the United States had produced over 96,000 aircraft in 1944 alone, more than Germany had produced in the entire war to that point. Another article detailed how American shipyards had built 2,700 Liberty ships since 1941, with construction times reduced from originally 240 days to an average of 42 days per ship by 1944. For prisoners who had witnessed the slow, resource-constrained production in German shipyards, these figures represented not just a difference in scale, but a difference in kind. Margarete Schultz, who had worked in a signals equipment factory before joining the military, found herself comparing German and American electronics production after being assigned to an electrical repair shop at Camp Shanks. The Americans were discarding radio components that would have been carefully salvaged and reused in Germany, she observed. Their copper wire had pure rubber insulation, not the substitute materials we had been using since 1942. When I mentioned the careful salvaging procedures we followed in Germany, the American supervisor laughed and said, "That sounds like a lot of work for not much return." They could afford to prioritize speed over material conservation because their supply was seemingly unlimited. This fundamental difference in approach, the luxury of prioritizing labor efficiency over material conservation, highlighted the different economic realities of the two nations at war. The prisoners also witnessed American logistical capabilities that dwarfed what the Wehrmacht had been able to accomplish even at the height of German military power. Helga Brandt, during her work in the camp administrative office, saw requisition forms for camp supplies that arrived with remarkable consistency, despite the ongoing global conflict. "I asked the supply sergeant how they could ensure regular deliveries when there was a war happening across the world," she recalled. "He looked at me strangely and said, 'Why wouldn't they arrive on schedule?' This was a revelation. The idea that war did not automatically mean shortages and delays, as it had in Germany since the first year of fighting. The American logistical network, with its redundant supply chains and abundant transportation options, operated with a reliability that seemed impossible to prisoners accustomed to the increasingly dysfunctional German supply system. Perhaps most devastating to German morale was the realization that what they were experiencing in the POW camps represented just a fraction of actual American capability. As 1945 progressed and Germany's military situation deteriorated, American newspapers available in the camp, libraries carried stories about post-war planning that revealed the United States was already shifting its industrial focus away from war production even before victory had been secured. Louisa Hoffman noted with astonishment an article discussing the reconversion of factories to civilian automobile production while the war in the Pacific still raged. "America can afford to start making cars for civilians again while still fighting Japan," she wrote. Meanwhile, Germany has converted every factory to military production and still cannot match their output. The disparity is not just large, it is unbridgeable. The women prisoners, many of whom had been selected for military service based partly on their ideological reliability, experienced this growing awareness as a form of personal betrayal. They had been assured by Goebbels's propaganda that America was a paper tiger, unable to sustain a prolonged war effort due to inherent weaknesses in its economic and social systems. The reality they encountered in American POW camps told a completely different story. Ingrid Weber expressed this sense of betrayal in a letter to a fellow prisoner. "We were told America was soft, undisciplined, and divided. Yet, what I have seen here is a nation so wealthy, so productive, that it can afford to feed its enemies better than Germany can feed its own people. How can you continue to believe in final victory when faced with such evidence? And if this was a lie, what else were we lied to about? This question, what else had been misrepresented by Nazi leadership, began to permeate the thinking of many prisoners as they integrated their direct observations with news of Germany's collapsing military position. The psychological effect was profound. Camp psychiatrists documented increasing cases of depression among prisoners as 1945 progressed, not primarily due to their captivity, but due to the cognitive dissonance between what they had been told about America and what they were experiencing firsthand. Dr. Walter Freeman, a psychiatrist who conducted evaluations at several POW facilities, noted this pattern in his reports. The German women prisoners appear to be suffering from a specific form of psychological distress, stemming from the discovery that their previous worldview was based on falsehoods. He wrote in June 1945, "Unlike typical prisoner depression, which tends to improve over time, this distress often intensifies as they accumulate more evidence that contradicts their prior beliefs." Several have used the specific phrase "betrayed by our leaders" in sessions, suggesting that their distress stems not just from Germany's imminent defeat, but from the recognition that this defeat was inevitable given the true balance of industrial power. This sense of betrayal was compounded by news that reached the camps as Allied forces advanced into Germany itself. Letters from family members, heavily censored but still conveying the deteriorating conditions in the homeland, described food shortages, fuel scarcity, and bombing destruction that contrasted sharply with the prisoners' current circumstances. Helga Brandt received a letter from her sister in March 1945 describing how their Berlin neighborhood had been living on turnip soup and ersatz bread for weeks. As I read her letter, I was sitting in a cafeteria where I had just been served roast beef, potatoes, green beans, and apple pie, Helga later recalled. The gulf between these two realities was so vast that I began to laugh, then cry, causing the guards to look at me with concern. How could I explain to them that my sister was slowly starving while I was being fed better than at any time since before the war? This jarring contrast accelerated what American intelligence officers termed the denazification process among the women prisoners. Reports from camp commanders noted that prisoners who had initially been classified as ardent Nazi supporters based on their intake. Interviews were increasingly expressing doubts about the regime as 1945 progressed. This transformation wasn't primarily the result of American re-education efforts, which were minimal in women's facilities, but rather the natural consequence of the prisoners' direct observation of American capability compared to Germany's diminishing resources. The psychological transformation experienced by the German women prisoners followed a fairly consistent pattern across different camps and among prisoners from varied backgrounds. Initially, most responded to evidence of American abundance with denial. The first reaction was almost always suspicion that what they were seeing was staged for their benefit, noted Captain Eleanor Richards. They would look for evidence that the food, the facilities, the supplies were somehow fake or temporary. This stage typically lasted from a few weeks to a month, as prisoners tested their hypothesis by watching for inconsistencies that never materialized. The second stage was often anger, particularly among the most ideologically committed prisoners. Margarete Schulz's diary from October 1944 captures this phase. If America has such abundance, such production capacity, why did our leaders bring us into war against them? Did they not know? Or did they know and proceed anyway, sending German youth to die in a mathematically unwinnable conflict? Either possibility is unforgivable. This anger, initially directed at American captors, increasingly turned toward the Nazi leadership as the evidence of Germany's precarious position mounted. The third stage typically involved bargaining, attempts to reconcile their observations with their previous beliefs. Some prisoners suggested that what they were seeing represented America's last resources being expended in a final push, or that German technological superiority would eventually overcome American material advantage. These arguments became increasingly difficult to maintain as 1945 progressed, and news of German defeats on all fronts reached the camps. Depression commonly followed as the prisoners integrated the reality of their situation with news of Germany's deteriorating position. Camp medical records show increased requests for mental health services during this period. Dr. Freeman noted that this depression had a different quality than typical prisoner melancholy. It is existential in nature, stemming from the collapse of a worldview rather than from the conditions of captivity itself. Many prisoners report that they feel they have been living in a fairy tale that has now been shattered by reality. The final stage, reached by many but not all prisoners before repatriation, was a form of acceptance that often included a re-evaluation of their previous beliefs about America, Germany, and the war itself. Louisa Hoffman exemplified this transformation in a diary entry from April 1945. "I came to America believing I was a prisoner in the land of our enemy. I now understand I am a guest in the country that will rebuild Germany after our inevitable defeat. The America I have seen here bears no resemblance to the America described by our propagandists. The question now is what other lies we have been told, and how Germany can find its way back to truth." This psychological journey was not universal. A minority of prisoners maintained their ideological commitments despite the evidence before them, finding various ways to discount or reinterpret what they were experiencing. Some simply refused to adjust their worldview regardless of contrary evidence, Dr. Freeman observed. However, these individuals represent a small minority, perhaps 15% of the total prisoner population, and are generally isolated by their fellow prisoners, who have come to different conclusions. These holdouts were often those who had held positions of responsibility or authority within Nazi organizations before their capture and had the most to lose, psychologically, by acknowledging the fabrications of the regime. For most of the women prisoners, however, the combination of direct observation of American abundance and news of Germany's collapsing position led to what one intelligence officer described as the complete bankruptcy of the Nazi worldview. This bankruptcy was evident in the prisoners' increasingly open discussions about post-war plans that assumed German defeat and American involvement in Reconstruction. By April 1945, camp monitors reported that the women's barracks at Fort Oglethorpe had shifted from discussions about when Germany might turn the tide of war to discussions about how the United States might help rebuild Europe after the inevitable Allied victory. The final months of the war saw this transformation accelerate as news of the Reich's collapse reached the camps. When information about the liberation of concentration camps began appearing in American newspapers available to the prisoners, many experienced a second, even more profound crisis of belief. "We had been told these were labor camps for criminals and saboteurs," Helga Brandt later testified. The photographs and descriptions in the newspapers revealed something far more monstrous. Coming after our discovery of America's true nature, this second revelation completed the destruction of everything we had been led to believe. For many prisoners, this sequence of revelations, first about American strength, then about Nazi atrocities, created a complete rupture with their previous identities and beliefs. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the women prisoners at Fort Oglethorpe and other facilities responded not with despair, but with a complex mixture of relief, shame, and uncertainty about the future. Camp reports noted that many prisoners appeared almost grateful that the war had ended, despite their nation's defeat. There is none of the defiance or bitterness one might expect from defeated enemies, Colonel Roth wrote in his May report. Rather, there is a sense of resignation that suggests many had already accepted the inevitability of this outcome months ago, based on their observations while in captivity. The process of repatriation began soon after the surrender, though it would be months, and in some cases more than a year before all prisoners returned to Germany. During this interim period, many of the women prisoners participated in educational programs offered in the camps, showing particular interest in American history, governance, and economic systems. There is a genuine curiosity about how America functions, Captain Richards reported in August 1945. Many prisoners have requested books on American industrial methods, agricultural practices, and democratic institutions. They appear to be mentally preparing for their return to a defeated Germany that will need to rebuild along new lines. This interest in American systems and practices would have significant implications in the post-war period. Following their repatriation to occupied Germany between late 1945 and early 1947, former POWs often found themselves uniquely positioned to navigate the new reality of Allied occupation. Their first-hand experience with American abundance had prepared them for the contrast between victors and vanquished, and their acquired knowledge of English and American customs made them valuable intermediaries in the early occupation period. Helga Brandt, returning to Berlin in October 1945, found her family living in a partially destroyed apartment building on severely restricted rations. Her experience in America had prepared her for this stark contrast, but her family was unprepared for the changed woman who returned to them. "My mother did not recognize me at first," she later recalled. "I had left thin and convinced of Germany's righteousness and ultimate victory. I returned heavier, healthier, and with a completely different understanding of the world. When I tried to explain what I had seen in America, the food, the factories, the casual abundance, they thought I was exaggerating or had been brainwashed. It took months before they began to believe my accounts, as they saw the same evidence in the American sector of Berlin." This pattern repeated itself across Germany as former POWs returned to their communities. Their accounts of American industrial might and agricultural abundance initially met with skepticism from civilians who had been exposed only to Nazi propaganda about the United States. Gradually, however, as the Marshall Plan began to demonstrate American commitment to European reconstruction, these former prisoners found their experiences validated and their insights valued. Margarete Schultz, who had been among the most ideologically committed Nazi supporters before her capture, returned to Munich in December 1945 and eventually secured work as a translator for the American occupation authorities. "My experience as a prisoner gave me an advantage," she wrote in a 1952 memoir. "I already understood that America's involvement in Germany was not primarily about exploitation, but about rebuilding a stable Europe. I had seen firsthand that America had resources to spare, and that their system produced abundance rather than scarcity. This knowledge allowed me to approach the occupation with pragmatism rather than resentment." Louisa Hoffman similarly found her POW experience advantageous in navigating post-war Germany. Returning to Hamburg in early 1946, she used her knowledge of American administrative systems to help her community navigate occupation regulations and access relief supplies. Those who had not been prisoners often approached Americans with fear or hostility, she noted in later interviews. "Having lived among Americans for over a year, I knew they were neither demons nor angels, but simply people from a different system, a system that, whatever its flaws, had demonstrated an ability to produce material abundance that our system had failed to match." The long-term impact of the German women POWs' experience extended beyond the immediate post-war period. As West Germany rebuilt in the 1950s under the economic policies that would eventually be termed the Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, many of the principles adopted had parallels to the American systems these former prisoners had observed firsthand. The emphasis on industrial efficiency, consumer goods production, and agricultural modernization reflected lessons learned not just from American advisors, but from Germans who had directly witnessed American methods during their time as prisoners. Ingrid Weber, who became an economics teacher in Stuttgart after the war, often cited her POW experience as formative in her understanding of productive systems. In America, I saw farms that produced more with 20 workers than German estates did with 200, she told her students. I saw factories where machines did the work that would have required dozens of hands in Germany. Most importantly, I saw a system where abundance was assumed rather than scarcity. This perspective influenced how I understood economics ever after. Her students, many of whom went on to positions in West Germany's burgeoning industrial sector, carried these insights into the companies that would drive Germany's post-war recovery. The transformative power of encountering American abundance extended beyond material production to cultural and social perspectives. For women like Helga Brandt, who had grown up under the increasingly restrictive gender roles of the Nazi regime, exposure to American women working in positions of authority represented another form of revelation. The American women officers at Fort Oglethorpe commanded respect from male colleagues, she noted in a 1971 interview. They administered complex systems, made significant decisions, and did so without constantly referencing male authority. This was different from what we had been taught was natural and proper in Germany. After returning home, Helga eventually immigrated to the United States in 1953, becoming one of approximately 5,000 former German POWs who chose to make America their permanent home after the war. The story of German women prisoners, encountering American grits, moving from mockery to appreciation as they recognized the abundance it represented, serves as a microcosm for the larger process of ideological transformation through direct experience. What began as a cultural misunderstanding at the breakfast table became, for women like Helga Brandt, Margareta Schulz, and Louisa Hoffmann, the first thread in unraveling a carefully constructed worldview. By the time they returned to Germany, they carried with them not just memories of unfamiliar American food, but a fundamentally altered understanding of economic systems, material production, and the gulf between propaganda and reality. Dr. Erich Kostermann, in his definitive 1978 study of returned German POWs, identified this group as particularly influential in post-war Germany, precisely because of the mathematical clarity of their revelation. For these prisoners, the collapse of Nazi ideology was not primarily moral or political, but empirical, he wrote. They had seen with their own eyes the productive gap between Germany and America, had eaten the evidence on their plates, had worn it on their backs. This material proof was, in many ways, more difficult to dismiss than any political argument could have been. This empirical quality gave their post-war testimonies particular weight as Germany struggled to rebuild both its physical infrastructure and its national identity. The breakfast table at Fort Oglethorpe, where Helga Brandt first encountered grits, has long since been cleared away. The POW camps that once housed nearly 400,000 German prisoners have been repurposed or demolished. The women who experienced the shock of American abundance have largely passed from the scene. Yet, the legacy of that moment of revelation, when a spoonful of unfamiliar cornmeal topped with an impossible pat of butter revealed the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat, continues to resonate. It reminds us that ideologies can sometimes be undermined not by counter-arguments, but by the simple reality of a full plate in a hungry world, and that the most effective refutation of propaganda may be found not in words, but in the everyday evidence of a system that delivers what it promises. For Helga Brandt, who died in Jacksonville, Florida in 1997, that first taste of American abundance remained vivid, even 50 years later. In her final interview, conducted for a documentary on POW experiences, she returned to that moment in the Fort Oglethorpe Mess Hall. "I can still taste those grits," she said with a small smile. Not just the flavor, which I came to enjoy, but what they represented. In that bowl was the evidence that everything we had been told was wrong. America was not weak or hungry or deprived. It was capable of feeding even its enemies better than Germany could feed its own people. Understanding this changed everything for me. It wasn't just breakfast, it was the beginning of seeing the world as it truly was, not as we had been told it must be. In that simple bowl of grits, topped with a generous pat of butter, lay both a nation's capacity and a regime's deception, served together for all who had eyes to see and mouths to taste.